Hey, welcome to the 6th of January. How time flies. Dis and dat information. We're going to look at something I looked at earlier, and I think it's worth returning and also including the a brief YouTube thing on degrowth and eco-socialism. Why we're doing this, or why I am doing this, is to return to a topic that I have been fiddling around with, and there's some fundamental issues, some definitional issues, the PR problem of calling something degrowth, which while it's an interesting branding idea, it runs very counter to the idea of the necessity for continuing economic growth, or defining it in a way that allows us to think of more steady state kind of approaches to a global economy as well as local or regional economies. So let me read this, and then perhaps we'll do a little bit of the audio YouTube that comes with this. In a recent issue of Monthly Review, Michael Lowy observed that the last 2 years have witnessed a growing coming together of eco-socialism and degrowth. Each side has been appropriating the arguments of the other. And the proposal of an eco-socialist degrowth has begun to be adopted as a common ground. The rationale behind this convergence is relatively straightforward. On the one hand, the central tenet of eco-socialism has been that any viable socialist project will need to pursue ecological sustainability and some substantive equality as two interdependent parts of a dialectical unity. In the context of the 21st century, this entails reducing the global social metabolism's total material and energy throughput while satisfying universal social needs. This, in turn, requires bringing about a convergence between different regions and social segments through reductions in the profligate waste propping up the capitalist system, redistribution of social wealth and decision-making, the free dissemination of ecological knowledge and socially beneficial technological innovations, and operationalization of principles of self-determination and autogestion. On the other hand, advocates of degrowth have increasingly recognized that any attempt to break with the fixation on economic growth and establish an alternate, more equitable conception of social wealth requires a decisive break with capital accumulation as the ordering principle of society, and therefore a viable alternative to the capitalist mode of social metabolic control. The resulting convergence, eco-socialist degrowth, indicates two important correctives to widespread misconceptions. On the eco-socialist side, the degrowth modifier indicates a conscious, planned project of metabolic restoration, while on the degrowth side, the eco-socialist modifier points to a transformative project rather than a simple one-sided negation of growth. It is in the context of this convergence that the English language translation of Kohei Saito's Japanese bestseller, Capital in the Anthropocene, has been published as Slow Down, the Growth Manifesto. This comes more than a year after the publication of the English translation of Marx in the Anthropocene, which, confusingly, was originally published in Japanese after Capital in the Anthropocene. Marx in the Anthropocene has been described as an academic text and is aimed at Marxists, whereas Slow Down targets a broader audience, selling over 500,000 copies in Japan alone. The two books largely overlap in their general argument for what Saito has dubbed degrowth communism, but aspects of his argument that are mentioned only briefly in one book sometimes receive fuller treatment in the other. For instance, Marx in the Anthropocene offers virtually no discussion of how degrowth communism might emerge from existing social struggles and movements, leaving the issue of transition virtually untouched. Slow Down, in contrast, identifies a handful of movements that prefigure or point to aspects of degrowth communism, including municipalism, his primary source of inspiration, rebellions by care workers, buen vivir, and food sovereignty. Citing the well-known 3.5% rule of Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Stephan that helped inspire Extinction Rebellion, the group, he argues that only a small part of the population needs to rise up sincerely and nonviolently to bring about a major change to society. Saito suggested this number could easily be met by the kinds of movements he mentions together with people sincerely concerned with climate change and passionately committed to fighting it. Now, what is growth? For Saito, the historical influence that Karl Marx's thought exerted on ecology and anti-colonial struggles is not sufficient to demonstrate why non-Marxists still need to care about Marx's interest in ecology today. Rather, the significance of Marx in this respect is that he carried his ideas forward in order to develop a more concrete vision of post-capitalist society, one we cannot afford to ignore today. Saito therefore advocates a degrowth communism that he claims is neither his invention nor the outcome of dialogue between movements for eco-socialism and degrowth, but rather constitutes Marx's own vision of post-capitalist society. In claiming this, Saito contends that he's going further than his 2017 book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, which built on the analysis of Marx's theory of metabolic rift introduced almost 2 decades earlier by John Bellamy Foster and Paul Buquet. Despite being awarded the prestigious Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize in 2018, Saito considers his earlier book inadequate because it stopped at noting how a call for sustainable economic development was part of Marxist eco-socialist thought. This, like Kevin Anderson's work, following on the work of others, demonstrating the non-Eurocentric development of Marx's eco-socialism, allows Marx to edge closer to a contemporary version of political correctness, but does not, in Saito's view, provide a sufficiently detailed schema for the society of the future built on the foundation of degrowth and deceleration, something that he contends can be found in Marx's later writings. Marx's last writings. By going farther, Saito also indicates that he views degrowth communism as inherently more radical than eco-socialism. This is because eco-socialism does not exclude the possibility of pursuing further sustainable economic growth once capitalist production is overcome, while degrowth communism maintains that growth is not sustainable nor desirable, even in socialism. Now, this seemingly simple distinction immediately raises a vital question that Saito never answers. What does growth mean, especially under socialism? Not only does Saito fail to answer this question, but he frequently moves between the concepts of growth, economic growth, productivity, and development of humanity's productive forces as though they all signify the same thing, which they do not. If by growth, Saito means economic growth as it has been defined since the mid-20th century as an increase in world GDP, gross domestic product, or income, then asserting that eco-socialism endorses this is a category mistake. One of the first principles of eco-socialism is the abolition of GDP as the universal standard in favor of qualitative indicators of human development and economic activity. If by growth, Saito means increases in material or energy throughput globally or at other scales, then the admissibility of such growth depends not only on its biophysical sustainability, but the social needs it is meant to meet under particular historical circumstances. These criteria can be neither categorically affirmed nor categorically rejected in advance, but depend on natural dynamics and the democratic decisions made by the future community of associated producers to which we are referring. This requirement applies with equal vigor to degrowth communism and eco-socialism. To proclaim all growth as an unmitigated evil simply to fall into the obverse of the ideology that proclaims all growth as an unmitigated good. In both cases, growth becomes an empty abstraction devoid of any connection to reality. But if by growth, Saito means increases in productivity, that is, increases in labor output per unit of production, then his characterization of degrowth is erroneous. Modern theories of the steady-state economy, such as that of Herman Daly, require continual improvements in productivity to ensure continued opportunities for qualitative development. The current correlation between productivity gains and material and energy throughput reflects the way that capital employs productivity gains and technological improvements as a means towards new capital formation. Yet increases in productivity do not automatically feed into growth. They could be used, for example, to shorten working hours or reduce material requirements. Improvements in labor productivity and overall efficiency are crucial to reducing the throughput of material resources and enhancing human welfare, as vital in a degrowth as in a growth economy, through those serving different ends. Sustainable human development is not only a necessity, but the fundamental objective of eco-socialism, and one would hope degrowth. Technological development is a qualitative factor that can be used for expansion or for doing more with less. Condemning humanity to stagnation of its productive forces, even in an eco-socialist context where this is removed from the accumulation of capital, would deny the subjects of Saido's future utopia the possibility of being what Istvan Meszaros calls genuine historical subjects, for they could not be in control of a life of their own, in view of being at the mercy of the worst kind of material determinations directly under the rule of incurable scarcity. Indeed, for Marx, human beings themselves are the most important productive force, and their development is essential to any genuine social advance. While even in the more restricted sense of those means of production separated from the actual producers, the productive forces under socialism could not afford to remain static, but would need to develop in accord with humanity as the self-mediating being of nature. Jason Hickel contends that degrowth scholarship embraces technological change and efficiency improvements to the extent, crucially, that these are empirically feasible, ecologically coherent, and socially just. To see productivity increases or advances in humanity's productive forces resulting from human social development or technological improvements as somehow inherently productivist and geared to exponential growth and thus opposed to eco-socialism or eco-communism, as Saido appears to suggest in his argument, would be to equate degrowth with actual stagnation. So you can see that, this is perhaps a nuanced difference, but one we need to pay attention to. As the status of degrowth communism as a superior alternative to eco-socialism is a central pivot of his entire argument, Saido's failure to clarify what he means by growth, and by extension, degrowth, renders it extremely difficult to determine, let alone assess, what precisely he's proposing. A categorical rejection of growth, applying to all historical circumstances, is insufficient even at the strategic level, let alone as a guiding principle of communism, which is concerned with securing the opportunities for the sustainable human development of every social individual. The Anthropocene crisis is not a product of growth as an abstract principle. As the Marxist sociologist and philosopher Henri Lefebvre pointed out, a society cannot actually operate with growth or production for the sake of production as a guiding principle. If it seems to do so, it is really producing for power and domination. The aforementioned ideology of growth appears to elevate growth to a principle, but in reality subordinates it, together with humanity's productive forces, to capital accumulation. Saido's flat rejection of growth in the abstract, therefore, does not render his version of degrowth communism more radical than eco-socialism or eco-communism, but rather less, in that it remains bound to the idea that either growth or its inverse constitutes a coherent principle rather than a strategic objective. He's correct that growth in the sense of further increases in total global metabolic throughput is neither sustainable nor socially necessary now, but this has not always been the case, nor will it necessarily remain the case indefinitely, while unlimited exponential growth has and remains an impossibility theorem. To the extent that a project of eco-socialist degrowth does indeed permit growth, this is not for its own sake, but because the associated producers have decided that such growth is both sustainable and socially necessary. Similarly, such a project would be expected to pursue degrowth or a steady state wherever this is deemed sustainable and socially necessary. In short, both growth and degrowth are strategies in response to material conditions rather than absolute principles. Now, this may be, splitting hairs, but it is important to always keep a good sense of what counts as definitions of sustainable growth. Marx's path to degrowth communism, the claim that it was Marx who first championed degrowth communism, raises another important question. That is, if Marx's vision of post-capitalist society was characterized by a categorical rejection of growth in any one or more of the senses mentioned above, then why has virtually every current of Marxism overlooked this important and potentially fatal aspect of his thought until now? Much of Saito's argument in both Marx and the Anthropocene and Slow Down is directed to this question, and the answer he offers is nothing if not original. To summarize, Saito argues that Marx himself did not arrive at the vision of degrowth communism until after the publication of the first volume of Capital in 1867. Saito contends that prior to his exposure, while writing Capital, to the work of Justus von Liebig and other natural scientists, as well as new anthropological research, Marx's thought was characterized by a combination of Prometheanism and Eurocentrism. Now, these two constitute the two pillars of the economism that Saito, drawing on Karl Popper, ascribes to historical materialism. Saito defines Prometheanism, which he uses interchangeably with productivism, rather than confining the former to an extreme version of the latter, as an optimistic endorsement of capitalist modernization, because technological and scientific inventions and innovations introduced under market competition lead to the elimination of poverty and shorter working hours. Now, perhaps an implicit recognition of the absolute absurdity of suggesting that Marx ever claimed that capital would eliminate poverty or shorten working hours without the working class forcing it to do so, Saito often conflates Prometheanism and productivism with a progressive view of history, as though to believe in progress itself is inherently Promethean and productivist. It is suggested that in Marx's analysis, these categories somehow refer to the same thing. Similarly, the logical counterpart to Prometheanism for Saito is Eurocentrism, which presupposes a linear progress of history that regards the Western capitalist countries with higher productive forces as located on a higher stage of history, such that other non-capitalist countries must follow the same European path of capitalist industrialization in order to establish socialism. Marx, Saito suggests, even in his mature works, was Promethean because he was Eurocentric, and Eurocentric because he was Promethean. Now, let me break here for a second and say that this sounds a little too tautological and a little problematic, but I think the larger picture is the overall question of the dominance or hegemony, as it were, of certain concepts of Western Marxism that we've sort of fiddled around with before, or the differences between the framing of a Western Marxism and a much more global kind of conception of what Marxism is or is supposed to be. In Saito's account of historical materialism, which is based almost entirely on analytical Marxist Jerry Cohen, G.A. Cohen's technological determinist interpretation of Marx's preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, these two beliefs of Prometheanism and Eurocentrism translate into the idea that a mode of production consists of the productive forces plus the relations of production, with the former acting as the independent variable whose perpetual increase triggers changes in the latter. This is the same notion of economic determinism that liberal thinkers have erroneously attributed to Marx. For Saito, following in the footsteps of Cohen, this allegedly led Marx to make the mistaken assumption that the increase of productive forces is a necessary and sufficient condition for a post-capitalist society, which in turn results in a productivist view of historical progress that treats the productive forces as the main driver of history and aims to unlock them from their capitalist fetters. In this account, Marx naively believed that a socialist revolution could simply replace the relations of production with other ones after reaching a certain level of productive forces. And this is a long standing, at least one stream of thought. Jerry Cohen's long since discredited interpretation of Marx, which is based almost entirely on 2 paragraphs of the short 1859 preface to a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, was subjected to withering criticism by such thinkers as Ellen Meeskins Wood and Terry Eagleton, far from the traditional reading of historical materialism that Saito portrays it to be. This interpretation generally is regarded as an extreme version of a crude technological determinist caricature of Marx's thought, whose penetrating insight rather highlighted the way that capital simultaneously expresses both a creative and a destructive side. Similarly, Saito's allegation that Marx's thought was Eurocentric up through the 1860s ignores much of the available Marxist literature on this, most notably Samir Amin's classic Eurocentrism, in which the term was first introduced. Whereas Saito conflates European ethnocentrism with actual Eurocentrism, Amin more precisely defines Eurocentrism as a culturalist distortion that views European culture as inherently superior. Although some of Marx's earlier writings contain traces of a certain ethnocentrism, at no point could his views be legitimately considered Eurocentric. Rather, Marx's entire perspective is historical, not culturalist, and that's a big arguable point, but interesting that Napoleano sort of makes that point. Saito claims that Marx's view changed fundamentally in working out his analysis of cooperation of the real subsumption, as opposed to formal subsumption of labor by capital, while preparing the first volume of Capital. Saito's claim here is an odd one, as by his own admission, Marx discussed the productive forces of capital in relation to cooperation and division of labor in the Grundrisse. There's no clear explanation of why cooperation there was less than an elementary form of capitalist production than in Capital. Moreover, the concept of the real subsumption of labor, in which power over the conception and organization of production was removed from labor and centralized in management via science and technology, was not actually discussed or addressed in any of the editions of Volume 1 published in Marx's and Friedrich Engels' lifetimes. Rather, this concept was developed in the Resultate, the original drafted Part 7 to Volume 1 of Capital, which Marx himself decided to exclude from the book, and which was not published until 1933. Now, that's a whole another argument we can have later on. Nevertheless, Saito, reading between the lines, claims that Marx saw a historically specific form of cooperation and the real subsumption of labor by capital with its debilitating effects on labor as altogether making it impossible to simply take over the existing capitalist forces of production in the transition to socialism. This leads Saito to contend that Marx, in writing Capital, broke with his earlier historical materialism, no longer allegedly privileging the forces over the relations of production. In fact, we're told that Marx finally arrived at a formulation in which he recognized the need to, quote, radically reverse the traditional historical materialist view, defined as the economic and technologically determinist view which Saito, following Cohen, claims that Marx himself adhered to prior to the publication of Capital, about the actual relationship between productive forces and relations of production. Marx is now seen as claiming that the relations of production determine the productive forces rather than the other way around. Here, Saito, in his exposition of what he calls Marx's methodological dualism, fails to consider the more dialectical possibility that both the relations of production and the productive forces might co-determine one another, even as one term in the relation exerts a stronger influence on the other. And let me break there for a second to talk about, well, this is a sort of a theory of asymmetry and symmetry that sort of is useful, and in fact gets us back to more fundamentalist readings of issues about transformation, about turnover, about exchange, et cetera, et cetera. Back to the text. The only evidence that Saito provides for what he sees as a dramatic reversal in Marx's overall outlook with respect to relations of production and forces of production is part of a single sentence in the preface to Capital, in which Marx couples relations of production and forms of intercourse with the mode of production. While not explicitly mentioning forces of production, there's a big argument about this, and this goes back to Althusser, et cetera. Saito ignores the fact that forms of intercourse is used interchangeably with forces of production in Marx's analysis. Saito admits this might be dismissed as a minor philological quibble, especially as there's nothing else to back it up. Nevertheless, he insists that it implied a decisive break with the traditional view of historical materialism, marking a radical shift in Marx's evaluation of the progressive character of capitalism, leading him to the eco-socialist transitional stage. The fact that Marx quoted favorably from his 1859 preface on the forces and relations of production in Volume 1 of Capital, without suggesting any fundamental change in perspective, is completely ignored in Saito's argument. Saito describes this now newly discovered transitional stage represented by Capital by the book Capital, as marked by important advances in Marxist thought, as he allegedly began to realize the productive forces developed under the capitalist mode of production do not provide a material foundation for post-capitalism, but instead need to disappear together with the capitalist mode of production. In the process, the productive forces of social labor, that is, cooperation, are diminished as well. Saito seems to disregard the fact that for Marx, all historical transformations work with what came before. Even in a revolution, there are no clean breaks. If socialism has to transcend particular forces of production, such as modern industry, it is, for the most part, to change them, not to abandon them altogether. Even at this point, however, when Marx is said to have largely abandoned his earlier historical materialism, that is, the determinate role of productive forces, Saito claims that Marx's perspective was still mired in latent Prometheanism and Eurocentrism. Thus, despite the overtly anti-colonial posture evident in his writings in the 1860s, Saito asserts that Marx continued to accept colonial rule from the perspective of the progress of human history as a whole, contending that Marx's Prometheanism, cum Eurocentrism, is not entirely displaced by his theory of metabolic rift and is particularly evident in his continued Eurocentrism and growth-oriented perspective. As supposed evidence of the Eurocentrism to be found in Capital, Saito points to Marx's warning in the preface to the first edition of Capital that the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future, and his comment in the main text regarding the riddle of the unchangeability of Asiatic societies. Yet, as John Bellamy Foster, has pointed out, and a simple reading of these statements in their actual context confirms, neither of these passages substantiates Saito's allegations. In the preface, Marx addressed his comments directly to readers in Germany who might be tempted to dismiss his critique on the grounds that the conditions in Germany, owing to a lack of industrial development, had not yet reached the level of class polarization then present in England. Later in his life, in correspondence with the Russian Marxists, Marx explicitly affirmed this point, indicating that his statement was directed at Western Europe and that his account of the developments there should not be read as a supra-historical principle. Saito, however, dismisses this as dissembling on Marx's part. He additionally contends that Marx's aforementioned concern with explaining the historically indisputable divergence between Asia's economic stagnation and Western Europe's rapid economic growth at the time of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries renders him guilty of Orientalism, and therefore, by extension, Eurocentrism. Yet, Marx does not attribute either industrial capital's consolidation in Western Europe or its failure to do so in Asia in his time to inherent cultural features, but to historical factors. Indeed, the actual context of Marx's statement is the stagnation of the village communities in Java, many of which, as Marx points out elsewhere in Capital, were subjected to the brutalities of the Dutch colonial slave trade. Based on this erroneous interpretation, Saito claims that Marx's eco-socialism, leading to the theory of metabolic rift in the first volume of Capital, still uncritically projects the trajectory of European history onto the rest of the world. This was only rectified when the last Marx of 1868 to 1883 experienced a coupure epistemologique, an epistemological break in an Althusserian sense, and went beyond eco-socialism to embrace degrowth communism. Now, this is a big step forward or backward, as however you want to read it, and it is probably one that will be argued further. The epistemological break leading to degrowth communism, Saito asserts, is reflected in Marx's call for a return to non-capitalist society, which indicates his abandonment of his earlier historical materialism and any recognition that any serious attempt at overcoming capitalism in Western society needs to learn from non-Western societies and integrate the new principle of a steady state economy. And this is a worthy argument, and one, you can argue through the late Marx on those issues, particularly because of his interest in a variety of not what he calls settler colonialism, but it's pretty clear that he is interested in that in his later interests readings. In the book Slow Down, Saito organizes these three stages of Marxist thought into a table that's reproduced in chart 1. Anyway, I'll paste that in later. The case that Saito offers for Marx's epistemological break in the 1870s depends heavily on rather circuitous readings of a letter that Marx wrote to Engels on March 25th, 1868, and the drafts of Marx's March 8, 1881 letter to Vera Zasulich regarding the fate of the Russian communes. That letter really does carry with it a lot of weight. Whether the weight is justified is a whole different question. In Marx's letter to Engels, Saito contends that Marx identified in George Ludwig von Maurer and Karl Nicholas Frost the same socialist tendency by which Marx meant an objective tendency towards socialism evident in historical developments. On this tenuous ground, Saito concludes that in 1868, Marx had reversed his earlier Prometheanism and recognized that pre-capitalist communes manifested the interconnectedness of sustainability and social equality, as if such a connection was not evident through Marxist thought, which is why we're told Marx started to simultaneously study pre-capitalist societies and natural sciences after 1868. According to Saito, Marx tied the two principles of sustainability and social equality to a steady state economy after he read Henry Louis Morgan's Ancient Society, in which he encountered Caesar's description of Teutonic communes as lacking zeal for agriculture while opposed to private property, such that this sort of agrarian commune basically repeated the same cycle of production every year. That is, the Marx long-lasting traditional mode of production realized a stationary and circular economy without economic growth, which Marx once dismissed as the regressive steadiness of primitive societies without history. Morgan, however, was not, as Saito contends here, Marx's first exposure to Caesar's description of the German Mark Association for the Administration of Lands held collectively, as Marx had already translated the source Tacitus's Germania into German by 1837 when he was 19 years old. Moreover, in Marx's time, references to societies, quote unquote, without history were literal references to societies without written history, a point often emphasized at the time. In his thorough account of Marx's analysis of communal reproduction in the Grundrisse, Meszaros confirms the fundamental link drawn here between substantive equality and sustainability, negating Saito's contention that Marx only made this connection after 1868. On top of this, Saido's claim that Marx linked these two principles together and to the steady state economy in his reference to the same socialist tendency with respect to Maurer and Frost is not substantiated by the actual text of Marx's letter to Engels. Rather, in this letter of 1881, I guess, Marx noted that Maurer's findings on ancient egalitarianism corresponded to an objective socialist tendency that scholars like Maurer were unaware of affirming. With respect to Frost, who came up separately in the same letter, Marx noted that once again, an unconscious socialist tendency, one that Frost himself did not even conceive of, becomes evident in observing the consequences of agriculture proceeding without conscious and rational control. The only sense in which Marx posits a common connection between these two scholars is in that they were both unaware, apparently, of the underlying objective socialist tendency. Nothing in this letter or elsewhere suggests that the slow development of productive forces in ancient societies recommended itself to Marx as a guiding principle. One of the points that Saido claimed as evidence of Marx's Eurocentrism is his antagonism towards Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, together with the mocking tone he adopted in the book Capital towards revolutionary populist socialist Alexander Herzen, along with German reactionary August Franz Ludwig Maria, Baron von Hochsthausen-Abenberg. Hochsthausen was a member of the Prussian Privy Council, who in 1847 to 52 wrote a study of Russian agrarian relations with the financial support of the Tsar. Marx's criticisms of Bakunin, which are well known, were far removed from the question of the Russian commune and can hardly be described as Eurocentric. Likewise, Marx's charges directed at Herzen and Hochsthausen in the first edition of Capital, which were removed in the second edition, quoted by Saido, had nothing to do with the Russian agrarian commune. Instead, they were directed at issues of racism and repression. Herzen had pan-Slavic sympathies, and Baron Hochsthausen was pro-serfdom. Saido claims that the mere fact that Marx criticized Herzen and Hochsthausen at all, since both had written on the Russian Mir, demonstrates his dismissiveness towards the Russian commune. Thus, Marx, he writes, did not recognize the revolutionary potentiality of Russian communes at all, with the proof of this being at the very time he was criticizing Herzen and Hochsthausen on entirely different issues. Agrarian communes called Mir or Obshchina still existed in Russia. The implication here is that if Marx had taken the Russian agrarian commune seriously at this point, he would have not voiced objection to Herzen's pan-Slavism, as well as the far more reactionary views of Hochsthausen, an aristocrat who donned armor to have his portrait painting. I'm not sure that weighs very well. A similar maneuver can be seen on Saido's part in his endorsement of Anderson's work demonstrating the development of Marxist thought away from its early ethnocentrism. Here he characterizes Perry Anderson's analysis as inadequate because it only deals with one aspect of Marx's historical materialism, that is Eurocentrism, neglecting the other, that is productivism. The drafts of Marx's letter to Zasulich in 1881, Saido contends, indicate a radical reversal on both points. As evidence of the reversal of Marx's Eurocentrism, Saido contends that these drafts indicate that Marx only now explicitly acknowledged the power of Russian rural communes to make their own history by leaping to socialism based on existing communal property without going through the destructive process of capitalist modernization. This becomes a more important point, obviously, in terms of policies towards the peasantry after the Russian Revolution. Saido claims that there is evidence of Marx's reversal on his alleged Prometheanism and his repeated references to replacing capitalist property with a higher form of the archaic type of property, that is, communist property, which is based on a quotation that Marx draws from Morgan's comments regarding the movement of society towards a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gens. However, such references to socialism as realizing higher forms of pre-capitalist or non-capitalist communal forms of property permeate Marx's writings throughout his life, though the draft letters to Zasulich refer to the replacement of capitalist property with communist property as a higher form of the archaic type of property, Saito contends that Marx's call for a return to non-capitalist society demands that any serious attempt at overcoming capitalism in Western society needs to learn from non-Western societies and integrate the new principle of a steady state economy. To bolster this claim, Saito points to well-known excerpts in Marx's ethnological notebooks of Morgan's discussion of communism and living, which Saito characterizes as having repeated the same cycle of production every year. That includes comments by Marx noting the similarities to the Russian communes. Marx's comments, however, suggesting nothing more than a recognition of common aspects in the structures of traditional non-commodity communal production that recurs throughout his work. Now, Saito nuances his argument on the Russian mirror as a model of degrowth communism by suggesting that Marx did not demand the preservation of the rural commune as it was, but rather advocated for the development of the communes on their present foundations by actively absorbing the positive outcomes of Western capitalism. However, what Marx actually said in his third draft of the letter to Zasulich was quite different from what Saito conveys. In Marx's own words, this is Marx, quote, communal land ownership offers it, the Russian commune, the natural basis for collective appropriation and its historical context, the contemporaneity of capitalist production, provides it with the ready-made material conditions for large-scale cooperative labor organized on a large scale. It may therefore incorporate the positive achievements of the capitalist system without having to pass under its harsh tribute. It may gradually replace small plot agriculture with a combined machine-assisted agriculture, unquote. Marx's statement here hardly indicated what he saw in the Russian communes, the new principle of a steady state economy. Rather, he suggested that communal control over advances to the productive forces achieved in Western Europe under capital could more effectively facilitate the development of Russian agriculture without capital extracting its harsh tribute. The claim that this in any way reflects a profound epistemological break leading to degrowth communism relies solely on fantastical extrapolations from Marx's extracts from other thinkers, where his own ideas were not developed. Believing that he has nonetheless conclusively established Marx's epistemological break through his evidence of a fundamental discontinuity is so slim, tendentious, and in many cases inconsistent with Marx wrote as to be non-existent, virtually non-existent. Saito finally parts company with Cohen to offer a very different interpretation of the last Marx. An important passage in this respect is the famous excerpt in the Critique of the Gotha program, in which Marx contended that, quote, in a higher phase of a communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and thereby also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-round development of the individual and all the springs of commonwealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to its ability to each according to its needs, unquote. Saito contends that the apparent continuity between this statement, written in Marx's supposed degrowth communist phase, is actually marked by a clean break from what he derives as Marx's naive endorsement of infinite wealth thanks to the development of productive forces and the continuation of the absolute domination over nature in the Grundrisse, which, as Bellamy Foster has repeatedly demonstrated, is a gross misinterpretation. In contrast to the Prometheanism that Saito claims to have demonstrated in the Grundrisse by severing one or two phrases from their critical dialectical context, Marx's concrete reference to the development of the productive forces in the Critique of the Gotha program, Saito avers, is no longer equivalent to the mere increase of productivity because productive forces are both quantitative and qualitative, as, of course, is productivity. Claiming that Marx has stood himself on his head, Saito maintains that the increases of the productive forces in Marx's analysis now refer to, quote-unquote, development of these forces in the sense of ensuring the free and autonomous activity of individual workers, which could actually contribute to sustainability and the steady state economy to the degree that This reorganization of the labor process may decrease productivity as though reducing labor productivity rather than promoting human needs over capital accumulation was the object of communism. The reference to the springs of commonwealth flowing more abundantly also takes on new meaning for Saito here. On this point, Saito elaborates on Marx's reference in the last edition of Volume 1 of Capital to the establishment of individual property on the basis of achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself, through the development of capitalist monopolies. This, for Marx, then set the stage for the negation of the negation, the expropriation of the expropriators. This is the third level of, how the dialectic operates. Contending that the richness of social and natural wealth was originally abundant in the sense that they did not possess value and were accessible to members of the community, Saito charges capital with producing an artificial scarcity that is created by thoroughly destroying the commons. Rather than technological advances, Saito suggests that Marx at that point viewed restoration, or what Saito also calls private citizenization, that is, the citizen management or municipalization of the commons, as the primary source of abundant wealth. Citizenship has always been a slogan of the right, since by definition it excludes those who are non-citizens. Nevertheless, however much the idea of a restored commons providing abundant social wealth is consistent with the thrust of Marx's argument, it should be pointed out that this has little to do with the context of Marx's actual comment on the negation of the negation in the passage cited. Saito nonetheless applies a similar interpretation of Marx's statement in the third volume of Capital regarding the expansion of the realm of freedom, contending that, quote, the expansion of the realm of freedom need not solely depend on ever-increasing productive forces. Rather, once the artificial scarcity of capitalism is overcome, people, now free from the constant pressure to earn money, thanks to the expanding commonwealth, would have an attractive choice to work less without worrying about the degradation of their quality of life, unquote. In this case, Marx did indeed maintain that shortening of the working day is the basic prerequisite to expanding the realm of freedom. But in the context of insisting that the productivity of labor is a more important determinant than the length of the working day and the actual wealth of society, that is, increased productivity when turned to the satisfaction of social needs rather than to capital accumulation, could allow social needs to be satisfied with less labor for all, rather than fed back into expanding production. Just as Marx did not suggest that mere increases in productivity would bring about the end of capital prior to 1868, he likewise did not reject the importance of productivity in reducing the burden of necessary labor after 1868. So, methodological dualism against dialectics of nature. Setting aside the absence of evidence for it, this notion of a radical break and wholesale reversal in Marx's thought, so profound that it led him to reject his own historical materialism and advocate a steady state economy 100 years before Hermann Daly, does not so much answer the question of why have Marxists prior to Saito overlooked degrowth communism, as it transmutes into why have Marxists prior to Saito failed to detect the incredible epistemological break leading to degrowth communism in Marxist thought. Saito seeks to answer this question by placing the blame on the shoulders of Marx's longtime friend and intellectual and political partner, Engels. Although somewhat critical of Western Marxism's handling of Marx and Engels, Saito does not object to Western Marxists expelling Engels and his mechanistic dialectic of nature from their analysis. Instead, he views this as inevitable for Western Marxists in order to prevent Marxist social theory from descending into the crude materialism of Soviet Marxism. Saito's own emphasis, however, is elsewhere, in rejecting the idea of a division of labor in which Marx focused primarily on society, while Engels focused primarily on nature or natural science. This is because, Saito claims, it denies Marx's interest in the natural sciences. Now, despite stating that his intention is not to scapegoat Engels, Saito asserts that Engels misdirected the Marxist project in two respects. First, Saito alleges that Engels hid Marx's own interest in the natural sciences in his preface to the second edition of Anti-Düring, while substituting his dialectics of nature for Marx's more nuanced combination of ontological monism and methodological dualism. That's a big argument there. The Upshot of this, in Saido's view, is that Engels was unable to transcend a mechanistic notion of the revenge of nature, quote unquote, that would only be prevented by asserting increased human control over nature. As a result, Engels allegedly restricted the realm of freedom to labor's increased mastery of nature through science and technology, and simultaneously encouraged a mechanistic understanding of society. Marx, in contrast, is described as more modestly eschewing the project of materialist dialectics that Engels was pursuing. Instead, Marx chose to confine himself to the dual relationship between the social and the natural metabolism in conformity with his alleged methodological dualism. Saido describes what he calls Marx's dualistic method as one of separating and unifying the purely social or formal, that is form, the purely social form, and the material, the stuff, in order to analyze how metabolism between humans and nature is transformed and reorganized under capitalistically constituted social relations. So we're looking at the separating and unifying purely social, or the formal, and the material in order to analyze how metabolism is transformed and reorganized. This supposedly allowed Marx ultimately to posit a larger realm of freedom that included aesthetic and ludic aspects, as well as science and technology, and by extension, shorter working hours, whereas Engels, in his Dialectics of Nature and Society, is strangely said to lack such insight. In the face of Engels' statement that he had read drafts of Anti-Düring to Marx, suggesting that Marx was in accord with his dialectical naturalist project and its presentation, Saido adamantly rejects this as not necessarily credible because this proof was provided only after Marx's death, which is to say, Engels lied. Well, for Saido, Engels not only failed to comprehend the full dimensions of Marx's theory of metabolism, but deliberately downplayed it, feeding into what Saido portrays as Engels' second distortion associated with his editing and publication of the unfinished second 2 volumes of Capital. Saido contends that Engels himself was unable to grasp the concept of metabolic rift in Capital, but rather maintained the earlier scheme of the antagonism of town and country already put forward in the German ideology. This, coupled with the supposed distortions incurred by Engels' Dialectics of Nature, caused him allegedly to modify Marx's manuscript in ways that obscured the theories of metabolism and metabolic rift, contributing to their neglect prior to the 21st century. Saido also laments that Engels' cleaning up of Marx's manuscript created the illusion that the 3 volumes of Capital are more or less complete in their current form. This, he contends, helped discourage Marxists from taking greater interest in Marx's investigations after 1868, which he views as an ongoing problem, with scholars outside Germany and Japan supposedly remaining largely ignorant of the importance of the Mega, that is the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, and the evidence of the epistemological break with historical materialism that Saido claims lies within. Certainly, Saido has not done much to substantiate the existence of such evidence, as his argument on Marx's supposed degrowth communism relies scarcely at all on Marx's extract notebooks, apart from the ethnological notebooks that have long been available. Foster has already thoroughly rebutted Saido's allegations against Engels, and the recapitulation here is intended to elaborate a few related points rather than cover the whole of Foster's critique. Footnote 68. Here, Foster does not bother responding to Saido's claim that Engels' editing of Capital made it appear too finished, as this is readily falsified by simply reading volumes 2 and 3. Rather, the 3 substantive charges that Saido levels are, number 1, that Engels lied regarding Marx's agreement with Anti-Düring; number 2, that Engels suppressed Marx's theory of metabolism and metabolic rift in his editing of volume 3 of Capital; and number 3, that Engels criticized Liebig's notion of metabolism. Now, these are undergirded by an attempt to reinforce Western Marxism rejection of Engels' Dialectics of Nature. You can see how this riff works, because the Engels version of this, of course, leads to various things that wind up in a kind of Soviet version. And that, well, anyway, that's for another story. The first charge is quite simply unfounded, based on nothing more than the unsubstantiated claim that Engels most likely lied about his relationship with his lifelong friend, and is entirely inconsistent with what we know of Engels' character. It says more about the lengths to which Saido is willing to go fit the evidence to his interpretation than it does about Engels himself. Indeed, Engels is not the only one whom Saido accuses of deception when his interpretation runs contrary to an explicit statement by the figure in question. In an attempt to rescue George Lukács's criticism of Engels' dialectics of nature and its implication from Lukács's own self-critical reflections in the 1967 preface to History and Class Consciousness, this is really important text, Saito asserts that Lukács distorted the history of his personal intellectual development, thus, in going so far as to chastise himself for his failure to address the concept of metabolism in his classic 1923 work, Lukács, Saito contends, neglected to point out in his 1967 preface that he had already demonstrated his awareness of the metabolism concept in an unpublished work, the now famous Taoism manuscript written in 1925 to 26. This is then taken as annulling Lukács's self-criticism for failing to incorporate the metabolism concept in History and Class Consciousness 2 years prior to this in 1923. But since the Taoism manuscript was written years after History and Class Consciousness, the inclusion of the metabolism concept there neither invalidates Lukács's criticism of his classic work, nor justifies Saito's charge that he somehow distorted his own personal intellectual development. In defending his charge of Eurocentrism in Capital, Saito, as mentioned, accuses Marx of being less than honest in his strong objection to Nikolai Mikhailovsky's attempt to turn the brief statement on the evolution of capital in Western Europe in the preface to the first volume of Capital into a supra-historical theory applying to every nation around the globe. According to Saito, it was Marx, not Mikhailovsky, who is wrong here. Mikhailovsky did not understand capital. On the contrary, it was Marx who changed his view after 1868, provided in his reply to Mikhailovsky a deliberately distorted view of his own work. The fact that Saito finds it necessary to accuse three different writers as significant to the history of Marxism as Marx, Engels, and Lukács of misrepresenting themselves regarding the manner in which they intended their text to be interpreted, since their statements contradict Saito's own interpretation, strongly suggests that it is his own reinterpretation that requires a critical reevaluation. Saito's second charge, directed at Engels, as Foster has pointed out, is more indicative of the philosophical assumptions with which Saito operates than of an actual misrepresentation of Marxist thought by Engels. A key issue here is the manner in which Saito attempts to fit the categories of natural metabolism and social metabolism into his methodological dualism, with natural metabolism representing the first-order mediation or material side of the binary, and social metabolism representing the second-order mediation or formal side. This is a mistaken understanding of Massaro's explanation of first and second-order mediations. In Massaro's account, first-order mediation refers to the necessary aspects of the social metabolism with the universal metabolism of nature common to all societies. In contrast, the category of second-order mediation refers to the specific alienated form this takes in different modes of social metabolic reproduction. Under Capital, alienated second-order mediations are portrayed by the apologists of the system as though they were for first-order mediations themselves. Moreover, to characterize dialectics, and materialist dialectics in particular, as dualistic at the methodological level, suggests a problematic dualism of ontology and epistemology, and is inaccurate inasmuch as the point of the dialectical process is to overcome dualism without lapsing into crude monism, or the night in which, as the saying goes, all cows are black. Saito nonetheless insists that, as opposed to Engels, Marx clearly distinguishes and contrasts two kinds of metabolisms, one social, the other natural, warning against the formation of rupture in their perpetual interaction under capitalism. Yet, in making this distinction, Saito fails to follow Marx's own lead in treating the social metabolism as an emergent process within the universal metabolism of nature, thereby providing the basis for the social metabolism to trigger rifts within the universal metabolism of nature. This is the argument for the Anthropocene, I think. Marx's alleged methodological dualism between the separate entities of the natural and social metabolism in Saito's account then resulted in the quote-unquote later Marx, in contradistinction both to the earlier Marx and to Engels, becoming increasingly aware of the likelihood that the annihilation The productive forces of capital result in the decrease of social productivity for the sake of more autonomous and sustainable production in democratic socialism. The third charge, finally, is a red herring. Contrary to Saido's contention that Engels did not cherish Liebig's theory of metabolism, there is not a single sentence in which Engels criticized Liebig on this issue. What Engels did criticize is Liebig's vitalism and his hypothesis of eternal life, in the sense that life had no origin, but it always existed together with its chemical constituents. The fact that Engels mentioned the metabolic interchange with the natural environment is a discussion of proteins and the basis of life shortly after criticizing Liebig's vitalistic views on the eternal character of life. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with whether Engels was capable of grasping the significance of the concept of metabolism, which was not Liebig's own, but was part of the scientific discussion generally, which Engels, in fact, explored in great depth. Wither the productive forces. The idea of the annihilation of the productive forces of capital raises the issue of Saido's understanding of the metabolic rift and its relation to the fate of humanity's productive forces in his vision of degrowth communism. His appeal to such annihilation and his contention that this would reduce social productivity seems to envision degrowth communism as a wholesale rejection of all development of humanity's productive forces under capital, with restoration of the commons, the only guarantee against this degenerating into a system in which privation, want is merely made general, and with want, struggle for necessities would begin again, and all the old filthy business would necessarily be restored. Saido, moreover, seeks to expand Harry Braverman's critique of the split between conception and execution. This is a characteristic of scientific management under monopoly capital, into a condemnation of the technical division of labor in industry more generally, prompting him to complain, contrary to Braverman himself, that modern workers are unable to create a complete product alone in the manner of the artisans who came before them, contending that the resultant impotence has infiltrated all aspects of everyday life. Saido further extends his condemnation to industry and urban life more broadly. Quote, most of us lack the ability to raise animals or catch fish for ourselves and prepare them properly for consumption. In the past, not only could people do these things, they could even make the tools necessary to do it themselves. Compared to them, we've been swallowed up by capitalism completely, lacking the power to support ourselves as living beings. We cannot survive without commodities. We have lost the know-how necessary to live in concert with nature. All we know how to do anymore is live our urban lifestyles, supported by the exploitation of the periphery. Now, what precisely Saido intends to express by this is, however, extremely opaque, as he also includes a number of qualifiers that render the prospects for further development of the productive forces under socialism unclear. He explicitly repudiates any idea that, in the criticism quoted immediately above, he is denying the productive force and technological advances fostered by capitalism and is expecting everybody to go back to nature to live primitive, rustic lives. And his advocacy of municipalism would certainly be inconsistent with the wholesale condemnation of the urban. Regarding science, Saido concedes that labor under any mode of production requires the rational regulation of natural law. Regarding technology, he similarly concedes that particularly harmful or onerous types of labor need to be reduced with the aid of new technologies, in addition to being distributed equitably. More generally, Saido posits a rule based on a distinction he credits to one of Andre Gortz's last works between open and locking, open technologies and locking technologies. Finally, Saido also qualifies his argument by acknowledging that it is true in some sectors production must improve, not grow, because some essential sectors are currently underdeveloped in capitalism. However, he restricts these sectors to education, care work, art, sports, and public transportation, all of which he contends are immune to unlimited growth, and in this sense, they are already realizing a stationary economy today. As the English title of his bestseller, Slow Down, implies, the idea that a transition to socialism entails a significant slowing down in production seems to be the central, if ambiguous, feature of Saido's degrowth communism. Importantly, this insistence on slowing down serves two functions for Saido. In addition to justifying the degrowth aspect of his vision of communism, slowing down production also serves to dissociate his Marxism from that of the Soviet Union. Saito expresses this intent in the preface to the English edition of Slow Down, contending that instead of the undemocratic state socialism controlled by the state bureaucrats, a more democratic, egalitarian, and sustainable vision of a new steady state economy proves compatible with Marx's vision of the future society. Saito claims that his age is an advantage in this undertaking, arguing that having been born in 1987, he never got to experience so-called actually existing socialism, by which he apparently means the Soviet Union, rather than China, North Korea, Cuba, or Venezuela, and therefore did not try to, quote-unquote, reflexively impose Soviet history onto Marxist thought. Now, ironically, many of the positions that Saito attributes to the first Marx, as distinct from the last Marx, such as a dogmatic linear stagism in which each country must proceed through capitalism to reach socialism, and an obsession with the wish to control physical nature in the external world, completely oblivious to the authentic Marxist vision of appropriation, as Lefebvre expressed it, appear more in line with Joseph Stalin and Western Cold War versions of Marxism than with Marxist thought itself. As already mentioned, Saito's claim that Marx initially disregarded biophysical limits and suggested that production could be infinitely expanded to satisfy unlimited social demands is not only unsubstantiated, but controverted by a more careful reading of the text on which Saito bases his claim. That is, the very part of the Grundrisse that Saito focuses on is also where Marx developed his dialectic of barriers and boundaries. In an assessment of the conceptions of wealth in both Hegel and Marx, Peter Stillman maintains that Hegel's emphasis on spiritual needs and Marx's emphasis on human development indicate that neither of them were advocating unbridled consumption, and that they both believe that the single-minded pursuit of abundance is also misguided because of its likely effect on nature. Both, therefore, would have regarded as ludicrous the common proclamations that economic productivity, consumption, or gross national product properly measures the quality of a country's way of life. Saito's claim that the first Promethean Marx was an advocate of unlimited growth and the second transitional Marx was an eco-socialist are as anachronistic as his claim that the third and last degrowth Marx ultimately came to admit that the principles of a steady state economy need to be rehabilitated in Western society. At a time when high-speed transport meant either a buggy driven by a particularly fast team of horses or over long distances a steam-powered locomotive. In all three cases, Saito is characterizing Marx's thought in terms of historical categories and concepts that did not exist in his time, when industrial capital was still confined to a small corner of the globe. Rather than simply relating to Marx himself, the sequence of the productivist Marx followed by the eco-socialist Marx and then the degrowth communist Marx appears to reflect more accurately the general stages through which Saito envisions the development of Marxist thought altogether. As Kent Klickard has pointed out, the ideology of growth did not emerge until the mid-20th century, when concern with economic growth became a theoretical focus, leading to the still predominant yet never realized belief that economic growth and technological change will save us from misery and provide an improved quality of life. Writing shortly after the first scientific challenge to growth in the form of the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report, Lefebvre related the issue of growth to a key historical shift in the productive forces between Marx's time and the late 20th century. Advocacy of either infinite or zero growth, Lefebvre maintained, together formed obverse ideologies of growth, reflecting the manner in which growth and development split apart and became contradictory with the advance of monopoly capital, with growth now threatening further development. To escape this ideological impasse, he suggested that growth needed to be anchored back to development in order to interrupt the former's growth's exponential curve and restore growth as a strategy rather than an economic necessity. We're getting close to the end. Maybe we're not getting close to the end. Yes, well, this is going to go on for far too long, but we are close to the end. Okay, degrowth communism versus eco-socialist degrowth. They're not identical, as I hope you've appreciated. Saito, however, bypasses these historical changes to trace the necessity of slowing down or degrowth to Marx himself 100 years before the publication of the Limits to Growth, divorcing him from all historical context. Here, Saito's account of Marx's degrowth communism is fundamental to what he calls the bold renewal of Marx's post-capitalism after the collapse of the USSR that is indispensable in order to enrich dialogues with non-Marxian environmentalism and to envision the possibility of human survival in the Anthropocene. Saito summarizes his positive vision of a bold renewal of Marx's post-capitalism in 5 fundamental principles, each of which he argues will slow down production. Number 1, a transition to an economy based on use value. Number 2, shortening of work hours. Number 3, abolition of the uniform division of labor. Number 4, democratization of the production process. And number 5, prioritization of essential work. By his own admission, these demands might at first blush resemble those of traditional Marxists, but Saito maintains that the ultimate goal, that is, deceleration, is very different. Inasmuch as Saito seems to view degrowth as a principle rather than a strategy, he is likely correct on this difference in goals. In a more systematic account that draws on the open totality of Marx's corpus, Burkett previously identified the same principles Saito expounds as important tenets of what Burkett more accurately characterized as Marx's vision of sustainable human development, which creates the necessary conditions for degrowth where needed without dictating it everywhere. Burkett, together with Bellamy Foster, offered a far more careful account of Marx's assessment of the development of the productive forces under capital that more closely follows Marx's dialectical approach to the issue, tracing both the progressive and the destructive sides as interdependent moments. As Burkett maintained, Marx critically acknowledged that capitalism's development of the productive forces contributes to humanity's historical potential by negating the scarcity rationale for class inequalities and creating new openings in the realm of human possibility. The result is a conception of production as an increasingly broad social process and the possibility of less restricted relations between humanity and nature. In short, capital has created the basis for conditions in which Henri Lefebvre suggests humanity's relationship with nature would turn out to be not instrumental, but one of co-substantiality and co-belonging. In this respect, Marx was consistently concerned with sustainable human development, even prior to the 1870s. The technical or historical division of labor that to Saito renders humans weak and impotent, to Burkett and Marx is another way in which capitalism is historically progressive insofar as it develops and socializes production to the point at which further advances in production as a system of human need satisfaction depend primarily on the universal development of people as natural and social beings. But it's precisely the latter task for which capitalist relations are singularly ill-fitted. The historical legitimacy of the wage labor relation rests on the direct correlation between individual labor and social wealth, which capital undermines by rendering labor increasingly social, and thereby placing itself in the position of imminent contradiction as it creates the conditions in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Meanwhile, capital's perpetuation of class domination and the individual appropriation of social wealth systematically prevents such free development of each. Saito, in contrast, appears to be advocating the restoration of individual autonomy and self-sufficiency against social labor. This raises important questions regarding the feasibility of the necessary global planning in Saito's vision. As Saito himself concedes, social planning is indispensable to banning excessive and dirty production and to staying within planetary boundaries while satisfying basic social needs. Whereas the recent convergence between eco-socialism and degrowth has largely been on the issue of planning and its global implementation, Saito never explains how he proposes to reconcile the need for planning at every level, from the communal to the global, with his municipalist vision. Given the way in which production is currently distributed across world-spanning commodity chains, attempting to scale down and localize production without attempts at comprehensive global planning informed by directly democratic decision-making at every level would not merely slow down production, it would bring it to a screeching catastrophic halt. In fact, indeed, Martin Hart-Landsberg has pointed out that amid the numerous lacunae and uncertainties surrounding the issue of planning, one certain insight is that because of the complex nature of economic processes, a transformative change in one area cannot be achieved in isolation. This implies that collective autonomy and self-determination in the production process need to be complemented by global cooperation and coordination. Eco-socialist degrowth has begun to draw important lessons and tools from the Soviet experience in China, but it is uncertain whether Saito would be willing to incorporate them into his degrowth communist vision in light of his complete antipathy to the Soviet Union and what he refers to negatively as climate Maoism. Although subtle, the differences between Burkett and Foster's interpretations and Saito's are important. As the former, Burkett and Foster carefully avoid the anachronism of trying to fit Marxist thought into historical categories that really do not apply to it. As Foster makes clear in his discussing Marx's ecology, he's not maintaining that Marx was an ecologist in the narrow technical sense in which the word is currently employed, while nonetheless emphasizing his conclusion that Marx's worldview was deeply and indeed systematically ecological in all positive senses in which that term is used today, and then this ecological perspective derived from his materialism. This is why the metabolic stuff is important. In a more recent work, Foster has demonstrated this materialism, rooted in Epicurus and evident even in the young Marx's doctoral dissertation, not only prefigured ecology, but actively contributed to its development through its influence on the natural sciences. Saito, in contrast, maintains that Marx himself was first a Eurocentric Promethean, then an eco-socialist, in which his ecocentrism cum Prometheanism had not been fully transcended, and finally, a degrowth communist. More subtly, but also more importantly, this points to an important methodological difference between the approach to Marxist thought and its contemporary meaning adopted by ecological Marxists such as Burkett and Foster, as distinguished from that of Saito. The former, that is Burkett and Foster, proceed very much along the lines of two conditions that Lefebvre maintained to find the defensibility of restoring Marxist thought, taking the totality of his work in its movement instead of excluding this or that a priori, and reconnecting this thought to the vécu, the lived experience of our own age with its multiple problems that remain in shadow. On this basis, Foster and Burkett have inspired countless other scholars and activists to take up Marx's theory of metabolic drift and go beyond it, using the concept to pursue new insights and ideas so as to go beyond finding fault, instead striving for humanity's opening the way of escape from the capitalist system. Saito, in contrast, bypasses the mediations of historical time and attempts to extract from the last Marx a timeless principle of degrowth equally applicable to his own time and to the present. Despite Saito's contention that degrowth is incompatible with capitalism, and it is essentially an anti-capitalist project, the prospects of his static rendition of Marx's vision of degrowth communism, inspiring the sort of mass movement needed to bring about the urgent transformation demanded by the Anthropocene crisis, seems doubtful. Notwithstanding his attempt to claim fearless cities, Buen Vivir, La Via Campesina, and other movements as degrowth mobilizations avant la lettre, the problem here is not that degrowth is politically unattractive and ineffective. It is that degrowth, like growth, cannot legitimately be elevated from the level of a strategic objective to that of an operational principle. The attempt to repudiate his first productivist Marx, Saito, moreover, resurrects several arguments that have been used to discredit Marxism en toto. It is, by way of contrast with this resurrected Promethean Marx, which in his earlier work he had ironically sought to bury, that he now attempts to redeem an ideologically purified final degrowth communist Marx. In this rendition, the transitional eco-socialist Marx almost seems to be advocating ecological modernization and has become an enemy of sorts. Not only is Marx torn from his historical context here, but the evidence advanced in favor of his redemption is so scanty that skepticism regarding this conversion would be partially justified, save that the evidence sustaining the accusations of Prometheanism and Eurocentrism from which Marx allegedly converted is even less valid, if more politically useful, than Marxism's opponents. His attempts to split Marx in this way create important problems regarding the totality of his critique of capital and capitalist society, overshadowing Saito's contention that Marx is clearly one of the few theorists who have developed a systematic critique of the capitalist system. Therefore, allegations of Prometheanism and Eurocentrism in Marx eclipse Saito's contention that by negating Marx's intellectual legacy too hastily, it becomes increasingly hard to criticize capitalism. Building a mass socialist movement to overturn capital and imperialism already faces the difficult challenge of countering prevalent anti-communist rhetoric and propaganda, legitimating discredited accusations against Marxist thought and of Marxist traditions that have been built upon it, threatens to undermine the dialectic of materialist theory and praxis altogether. To counter growth-oriented capitalism with degrowth-oriented communism falls into the trap of crude, undialectical inversions in which history is characterized by clean breaks. A more complex dialectical ecology is offered by the notion of sustainable human development, which does not rely dualistically and at the level of principle on growth versus degrowth, but is directed at human historical development, rooted in the struggle for substantive quality and ecological sustainability. It's not clear that Saito views a mass movement to socialism as really necessary in light of his explanation of it in a recent interview that what I'm calling for is not a revolution like the Russian Revolution. I don't think we can break the system by taking power, but changing our consciousness and behavior in daily life creates more room for demanding more radical changes. That way, I think we will make a gradual transition to a degrowth society. Under this lens, the inverted order of terms between Saito's degrowth communism and the recent convergence around eco-socialist degrowth may be indicative of a more fundamental inversions alluded to between means and ends. In the context of socialist degrowth, Jason Hickel declares that degrowth, the framework that has cracked open the imagination of scientists and activists over the past decade, is best understood as an element within a broader struggle for eco-socialism and anti-imperialism. Saito's degrowth communism, in contrast, at best views eco-socialism as a stepping stone on the path to degrowth. Thus, the ecological revolution that eco-socialism entails, that is, a social rift in response to the metabolic rift, is apparently a misguided deviation. With degrowth, that's the true stake of struggle. While the experiences of socialist experiments to date aptly demonstrate that the difficult task of building socialism certainly does not stop with the political revolution, the ongoing experience of an increasingly brutal and potentially fatal capitalist system strongly suggests that building socialism, communism, or any degrowth variant thereof still requires a social revolution, and that these experiments should not be quickly discarded as mere historical errors. Indeed, given the lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic and the rapidly escalating severity of the social ecological crises in the Anthropocene, any human future at this point would seem to pivot on a radical and revolutionary transformation as part of a longer process of transition towards a society organized around fundamentally reconstituted principles of sustainable human development. Now, if you could keep your attention through all of that, you're probably better than I am. I think it's a subtle distinction. It seems less strategic and more tactical. But that's the completed commentary by Brian M. Napolitano, who writes in a monthly review on was Karl Marx a degrowth communist? And I've included, to give you the sense that of Jason Hickel, a interview with Jason Hickel, and you can it's an hour-long interview, but I think it's useful, and I recommend it to you to get a handle on this idea. What Napolitano is trying to do is to say there are certain issues that come from what is essentially a series of, and without overgeneralizing, a certain, as it were, Japanese approach to Marx that, has a history, and not a problematic one, but it is one that requires attention to the subtle differences of what counts as cooperative collective behavior and what is to be done. And it is a continuing problem that exists for every activist. The question of correct action, intensity of correct action, a good sense of what the longer goals are, and the willingness to operate together collectively. So those I think are all the important elements. Let me look at the chat to see if there's oh my goodness, a birthday somewhere in there. We're serfdom, the war in Iran. there should be a huge social movement demanding that instead of using technological progress to produce more and more crap, using progress as a chance to spend less and less time working. That is the kind of conflict that we come up with in terms of public policy. And then surf, autogestion. Yes, indeed, a concept. Similar but not identical, of course, to fully automated luxury communism. Anyway, so those are, if there aren't any immediate interventions, brickbats,
I did have a
denunciation.
question. I'm
Oh,
not sure
sure, Larry.
what autogestion is. I'm thinking ingestion, suggestion, but I'm not sure what autogestion is. Is that?
Well, I would assert that there is some resemblance to fully automated luxury communism, but let's actually go to the denotative element.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Could have followed that.
Yes, this autogestion is like the operation school of control and management of an enterprise by representatives of the workers. It's syndicalism, I suppose.
Oh, so it's not like a person. It's more of a.
No. It's a organizational principle.
Okay. Well, that helps.
I think it actually comes from, it's Mediterranean, I think, in origin. I mean, it relates to all those folks who want to seize worker control of factories and stuff like that.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thanks.
Yeah. And worker organization is really that important element. It's very Italian in that sense, although I would assert that it's much more Mediterranean. But it's syndicalist in that sense, where it's the application of the idea not in terms of a state. You don't need to have the state organize these things, but you just work it. It's like worker councils or whatever.
They still need to be organized. Yeah.
Within the workplace, you democratize the workplace, which I think always should happen. I mean, it just should happen. That's just it. I think things work better that way.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you
just
could
don't
do like
think.
an experiment, compare.
Well, yeah, and more needs to be encouraged on that score, and not to always measure it against. Well, it's not as efficient or whatever that means.
Yeah, well, yeah, and this, measure everything by GDP seems flawed, on its
Well,
face, but
it goes back to all kinds of other measures that we can compare the difference between, you Freire and the banking system of education, where you accumulate credits or whatever, all of, schools as factories, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean to say that, speaking as a former bureaucrat, that, I actually like the idea, because then once we got everyone thinking about credit hour production, we could actually, eliminate duplication and other stupid things, For example, to show how old I am, I once worked at an institution that had a photography course for journalism and a photography course for art and design. And I thought to myself, we don't have to have two different courses. We could combine this with one course. But that went over like a lead balloon for all the usual. Similarly, I used to have that at another job. I thought to myself, well, I actually agree with the idea of replacing language requirement, not replacing language, but augmenting language requirements with learning computer languages, for example.
yeah, it's
As a
like another
function of
language.
computer
Yeah.
literacy. But trying to get that shit through bureaucratic channels is like, the only way to do that is to be a Leninist and sort of take power, which is why I kept on trying to become a provost, that's a silly idea. Anyway, so much for that. So much for personal reflections on on a failed life. But anyway,
Well, no, you got wisdom.
but these are old ideas. You see, I don't think these is anything new or creative. And I think that other people, once I started yakking about them, I didn't care whether they were my ideas or not. I would hope that other people would go, that's a good idea. We should do that. And
but nobody did.
stodginess. Anyway, I think that's I've really gone over my time. So let me stop here
Thank you.
and return us